Good morning and thank you for being with us. We're going to be looking at a passage in John chapter 11 today in preparations of the Lord's Supper, partaking in the Lord's Supper. And it has to do with Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. So we're going to look at this passage, and starting in verse 1, I'm reading from the New American Standard. Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was the Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. So the sisters sent word to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. But when Jesus heard this, he said, This sickness is not to end in death, but for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified by it. So when Jesus found out that Lazarus was sick, he was a friend of Jesus, but he didn't go right away over there to heal Lazarus. We look in verse 11. Jesus said, Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go so that I may awaken him out of sleep. And the disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he'll recover. But now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he was speaking of literal sleep, so that Jesus said to them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and I am glad for your sakes that I was not there, so that you may believe. Let us go to him. So Jesus was glad that he wasn't there so that the disciples could even further solidify their faith in knowing that Jesus was the Son of God. And it also to be able to provide a method for everyone else to know that Jesus was authentic. He was a representative of God. So we see that Martha meets him on the way down to Bethany. And he says in the scriptures say in verse 22 that even now, this is Martha, even now I know that whatever you ask of God, God will give to you. Jesus said to her, Your brother will rise again. And Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even if he dies. And everyone who lives and believes in me shall never die. Do you believe this? Well, we, like Lazarus, were dead. If we look over in Ephesians chapter 2, we look at a passage. Ephesians chapter 2. I'm going to be reading in verse 1. And you were dead in your trespasses and sin, and in which you formerly walked according to the course of the world, according to the prince of the power of the air, of the spirit that is now working in the sons of disobedience. Among them we too all formerly lived in the lust of the flesh, indulging in the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, even as the rest. But God, being rich in mercy because of his great love with which he loved us, even when we were dead in our transgressions, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised up with him, and seated us with him in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus. So we were raised up just like Lazarus was raised up in the watery grave. We'll continue on back in John chapter 11, because this is the important section that I wanted us to see, that after the fourth day, when Jesus came to Lazarus and raised him from the tomb, they pleaded with him not to open the stone, not to go in there because of the stench. But he still went ahead, and he prayed to God. This is important to me. I thought in verse 41 is, so they removed the stone, and then Jesus raised his eyes and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you have sent me. And so he cried out and he said, Lazarus, come forth. And look at verse 45, the response. Therefore many of the Jews who came to Mary and saw what he had done believed in him. So some of those people that had came to Mary because of Lazarus saw what Jesus had done and believed in him. Isn't it ironic that those Jews who believed in him now, just a little while longer in the future, won't believe in him when he raises himself from the dead? So In verse 46, some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Jesus had done. And those chief priests and the Pharisees were kind of after him. So he fled and he went over to a city called Ephraim. But the Passover was near. And look at chapter 12 and verse 1. Jesus, therefore, 6 days before the Passover, came to Bethany where Lazarus was, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. So we're 6 days before Passover, and Jesus had come back to Lazarus' house now. And verse 2 says, So they made him a supper there, and Martha was serving, but Lazarus was one of those reclining at the table with him. So isn't it interesting now that before the Passover meal, Jesus goes back to Bethany and now is sitting at the table with a man who had been dead, but now raised up, sitting at the table, having a supper with Jesus. They had made a supper for Jesus, but it wasn't Jesus' supper at the time for the Lord's Supper. But it's interesting that Lazarus, once dead, now sit with Jesus or in Jesus' presence to sit down and have a meal with him, have a supper with him. For us as Christians, we were dead, and we have been raised up, and we have the communion with the Father through Jesus. We have Jesus in our presence. Let's look at another passage in Romans chapter 6 and verse 4. Therefore we have been buried with him through baptism unto death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in the newness of life. So, similarly to Lazarus' death, burial, and then resurrection by Jesus, we as Christians have also been dead to sin, and we've been buried, and we have risen from the death. We get to now come together and observe the Lord's Supper, remembering Jesus and remembering who he was,